As the clock strikes midnight here in Central Europe, the UK will enter a transition period marking the end of almost half a century of integration with Europe. Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon says she's stepping up her push for a fresh independence vote, saying that Brexit has set the UK on what she called the wrong road. And the first plane repatriating French nationals arrives back on home soil as thousands of foreigners are evacuated from the coronavirus epicenter in China. Welcome back to the France 24 newsroom in Paris. I'm Tom Burgess-Watson. Thank you very much for joining us. We're going to begin in the UK, where the country will today end what has been almost half a century of integration with Europe. As the clock strikes midnight tonight here in Central Europe, or 11 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, the UK will become the first country ever to leave the 28-member bloc, and it will then go it alone for the first time since 1973. Well, for the next 11 months, there's going to be a transition period during which a deal will be negotiated outlining future relations between the UK and the EU, which is its largest trading partner. Well, the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has assembled his cabinet for a meeting today in the town of Sunderland, which is in the northeast of England. It's a symbolic choice of venue for a meeting because it was there in Sunderland that was a pro-Brexit stronghold in the 2016 referendum. We're expecting to hear from Prime Minister Johnson later today in a pre-recording address in which he'll call Brexit a beginning, not the end. Meanwhile, here's what people on the streets of London had to say about today's developments and the UK's departure from the EU.
I think it's an utter disaster. It's awful. In a world that seems like it's going mad, we need to be closer and closer together.
It's nice to know that we'll move on and start rebuilding. So hopefully that will be positive.
I think it's a great relief that we're finally leaving the EU. It's no disrespect to members of the EU countries. Absolute respect for them all the time. But the EU is a con. It's been a con since we started, and I'm so glad we're leaving.
Okay, perspective there from the streets of London. Well, let's get perspective from Northern Ireland now and speak to France 24's Chris Moore, who is in Belfast. Chris, just tell us what the reaction there has been to today's events.
Well, first of all, Tom, Boris Johnson's argument of get it done, the idea of Brexit fatigue, applies just as much here as it does across the UK, although perhaps not in quite the same way. I think there's a feeling in Northern Ireland, after all a very small part of the United Kingdom, that it was affected and subject to the winds of Brexit more than anywhere else. So much of the debate in recent years centering on the issue of the Northern Irish border. Now that issue has obviously seen movement. A lot of the wrangling was over the prospect of a hard border on the island of Ireland, something which the EU was desperate to avoid, not to threaten the Good Friday Agreement. That border, of course, now effectively moves into the Irish Sea, but as such potentially brings with it a whole new set of challenges and problems. And a lot of people here wondering how that particularly is going to pan out. Northern Ireland leaves the EU along with the rest of the UK later this evening, but in some ways maintains a bit of a foot in it. And as those trade talks go ahead between the UK and the EU ahead of what Boris Johnson says will be a definitive exit at the end of this year, I think the fear for a lot of people here in Northern Ireland is that that's a conversation that they fear being left out of.
Yeah, and people there in Northern Ireland as well must feel a bit of a tug of war going on, sort of conflicting loyalties between, their sense of Irishness and their sense of belonging to the United Kingdom. I mean, what are people telling you?
That's right, yes, and any major political wind change, and Brexit is undoubtedly that, is always here going to be seen through the prism of that difficult troubled history. You only have to look at the political reactions. For example, the DUP, the main unionist party whose raison d'etre is Northern Ireland as an integral part of the United Kingdom. Well, now there's that border I was just talking about. There's the fact that Northern Ireland continues to exist under some EU rules, and they, of course, called it a betrayal act by Boris Johnson. On the other side, Sinn Féin, Irish nationalists, the worst for them was avoided with the potential re-emergence of a hard border for now. But at the same time, of course, Northern Ireland remains firmly within the United Kingdom. They've been using all of this as an opportunity to reiterate their desire for a unity referendum on the island of Ireland. Those are just the political views. Of course, that is then refracted out against the various shades of the population. But in terms of getting a deal, a withdrawal agreement, there was perhaps no one solution which could satisfy everybody.
OK, well, thank you for that update from Belfast. France 24's Chris Moore, thank you. For the most part, the UK's big cities voted to remain in the EU, as did Northern Ireland and Scotland. Well, in Edinburgh, the EU flag is not going to be lowered outside the Scottish Parliament tonight. It's a symbol of their opposition to Brexit. And today, Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, said she is ready to step up the campaign for a fresh independence referendum and end Scotland's 3 centuries union with the United Kingdom. Well, she wants that vote to be held as early as this year. She argues that Brexit has set the country on what she called the wrong road. France 24's Alison Sargent has more.
She's sad, she's angry, and she's not wasting any time. As Britain pulls Scotland out of the EU, Nicola Sturgeon pleaded for Scottish voters to join her in seeking independence from the United Kingdom.
The UK that Scotland voted to remain part of in 2014, a UK inside the EU, will no longer be a reality. A new independence referendum will put the decision about the best path for Scotland into our own hands. And there is a cast iron mandate from both the public and from the Scottish Parliament for that referendum.
62% of Scottish voters rejected Brexit and have given Sturgeon's Scottish National Party a majority in the last 3 elections. But a political mandate is not the same as a legal right.
To have another referendum in Scotland, you would really need the Parliament in Westminster, so the UK Parliament, to approve that referendum. And the government at the moment has been absolutely clear. There will be no bill presented in Parliament, and there will be no vote on whether or not Scotland should have another referendum.
To keep up the pressure on Boris Johnson, Scottish Parliament voted their support for a second referendum earlier this week. If political pressure doesn't work, Nicola Sturgeon says she's not ruling out challenging the Prime Minister in court. In the meantime, Scottish MPs voted to keep the EU flag flying over their parliament as a demonstration of regret. And many Scots will be holding candlelight vigils as the clock strikes Brexit, a message to the EU to leave a light on for Scotland.
We're going to be following developments there in the UK throughout the course of the next 24 hours or so. This evening at 11 p.m. Central European Time, we'll have a special edition that's 1 hour before the UK officially leaves the European Union. So we're keeping a close eye on developments there. In other news, on Thursday, the World Health Organization declared the coronavirus outbreak to be a global emergency. And today, China's National Health Commission said that nearly 10,000 people are known to have been infected. And at least 80 cases have been confirmed outside of China, including here in France, the UK, and now in Italy. Well, thousands of foreigners are being evacuated from the epicenter of the outbreak. And the first plane repatriating French nationals has arrived back here in France. It came back at lunchtime today, only for officials to then say that one of the French nationals on board that aircraft has been hospitalized after showing symptoms of the coronavirus.
Touching down on French soil after taking off from the Chinese city of Wuhan. Some 180 French nationals were on board this military plane. One has been hospitalized with symptoms of the virus. The rest will be kept in quarantine for 2 weeks at this holiday camp. Meanwhile, Italy has declared a state of emergency and stopped all air traffic with China after announcing its first cases in 2 Chinese tourists. The UK too saw its first 2 cases in the north of England on Friday, as Germany sends a military plane to evacuate its citizens from the infected zone.
There are no suspected cases among these people. In order to guarantee German safety, the evacuees will be quarantined for 2 weeks at a German army base. We are making use of the flight there to supply the Chinese authorities with equipment which they are lacking.
Authorities in Hubei province say they're running short of medical supplies as a rise in infections in 2 cities close to Wuhan sparked fears of new hotspots for the virus. After the WHO declared a global health emergency over the outbreak on Thursday, Beijing sought to reassure the rest of the international community.
We have already taken the strictest prevention and control measures. We have the confidence, ability, and control system needed to beat the epidemic.
Concern is growing over the rise in infected patients worldwide who've not been to China, including cases in Thailand, Taiwan, Japan and the US. Washington has now advised its citizens against travelling to China, while Singapore was one of several states to bar arrivals from the country.
Now, there's growing pressure on Iraq's political elite to name a new prime minister. This is the country's top Shia cleric. The Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani has today delivered a fiery sermon in which he condemned the use of force against anti-government protesters, while the country is entering its 5th month of violence. And in recent weeks, the security forces have stepped up their crackdown on demonstrators. France 24's Jack Hewson has this report for us now from Baghdad.
We're here near Wafba Square, close to Tahrir Square, which has become the de facto front line of this protest movement. Protesters say that clashes have intensified with the security forces firing at them on a day-to-day basis.
Earlier this morning, they shot at us with tear gas and pellet guns. They target the eyes and sensitive areas to hurt us.
In America, they use pellet rifles to hunt birds. Here they think we are like animals and they hunt us with them too. There, they use it to hunt birds. Here, they use it to hunt humans. Look, they shot me with their pellet guns. They think I'm a pigeon.
The clashes have worsened, according to the protesters, since the withdrawal of support by Muqtada al-Sadr, the hardline Shia cleric, for their movement. They say things are getting worse for them here, with the violence intensifying.
When Muqtada al-Sadr sent his men from Saraya al-Salam, they stood with us and protected us here. But after his protests against the US, they retreated and sold out our cause. They even burnt the tents there.
Today's an important day for the protesters to show up in large numbers. After last week, they felt somewhat forgotten by the focus on anti-American rallies. They're here today to reiterate their demands for a new prime minister to replace Adel Abdul Mahdi. The deadline's for tomorrow, but unfortunately it's very unlikely that a suitable candidate that meets their demands will be met, as they want someone outside of the party system and outside of the political establishment.
France 24's Jack Hewson reporting there from Baghdad. A state of emergency has been declared in the Australian capital, Canberra, as high temperatures and strong winds have made the already unpredictable wildfires even more difficult to bring under control. Well, the mercury is well above the 40 degrees Celsius mark, and since the fatal wildfires began in September, more than 11 million hectares of land have been scorched. Well, it's not just the Canberra area, but also the states of New South Wales and Victoria that are experiencing heatwave-like conditions this weekend. France 24's Colin Kinnenberg tells us more.
After a brief respite, Australia's summer bushfires have once again reached crisis levels. With temperatures soaring above 40 degrees in Canberra and no rain in sight, fires are spreading from the forested south of the region north towards the capital. Authorities said the blaze could become uncontrollable.
The ACT is now facing the worst bushfire threat since the devastating fires of 2003. The combination of extreme heat, wind and a dry landscape will place suburbs in Canberra's south at risk in the coming days.
It's the first time a state of emergency has been declared in the Australian Capital Territory since 2003, when fires killed 4 people and destroyed almost 500 homes. Residents say they're doing what they can to prepare.
I think we're pretty okay right now. We were here in 2003, so we've seen what it can be when it comes through. We've just been getting everything ready, getting water in every receptacle we can find, making sure all our tanks are full.
Others say they're concerned that the government hasn't done enough to prevent fires from spreading.
Well, the landholders and community are worried that since the 2003 bushfires, there has not been enough land management, and we just would have liked to have seen some more before this fire occurred.
According to environmentalists, clearing more brush during the cool season could help keep bushfires under control. Australia's fires have killed 33 people and an estimated 1 billion animals since September, fueling calls for the government to take decisive action on climate change.
Well, that brings us up to date with the world news. Thank you for watching. Do stay with us here on France 24.
Special events. This time, it's actually happening. Join me, François Picard from London, for Brexit Day coverage. Catherine Nicholson will be there too, counting down to midnight with our teams in Scotland, in Northern Ireland, right here on France 24.
Watch events unfold on France 24 and France24.com.